Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. I'm delighted to be joined today by an old friend of the Perth US Asia Centers and someone who is, by his own confession, part of the Darwin-Perth mafia when it comes to Australia-Indonesia relationships. Dr. Andre Omar Siregar is currently the Director for Intra and Inter-Regional Cooperation, Asia, Pacific, and Africa, in the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Most of our viewers will know Pak Andre from his time in Darwin as the Indonesian Consul General there. He has a PhD from Charles Darwin University, served in the Indonesian mission to the United Nations, and is assistant to the special staff of the President for International Relations under President Dr. Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who many of you may know served as a distinguished fellow at the Perth US Asia Center and a visiting professor here at UWA. So we were delighted to work with Pak Andre to bring SBOI not only here to Perth, but also to Darwin. So I think that's part of our close collaborations. Pak Andre, thank you. Thank you for making time. It's good to connect virtually if we can't meet in person.
It's a pleasure, Dr. Gordon. Again, it's always a pleasure to catch up with friends in Perth. We've had a long collaboration and cooperation, and just by chance, from Darwin back to Jakarta, we're still in the same field of regional cooperation. So discussing this with you is truly one of the ticks I have to put in my box. Had a chance to talk with Perth US Asia Center to share some ideas. So thanks a lot for inviting me over.
Well, it is our pleasure, and I'm really delighted to have someone with your background in this regional role. And I love the phrasing, both intra and inter-regional. That really kind of highlights the unique role that Indonesia plays. Historically, both Australia and Indonesia tend to look at our relationship bilaterally. And we tend to focus on the bilateral relationship. And yet, we both sit at the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific. There is this emerging construct of the Indo-Pacific. I wonder if you might give a little thought to how Australia and Indonesia both view the Indo-Pacific. Do we view it the same, or do we view it differently?
Firstly, again, thanks a lot, Gordon, for those straight to the point questions. And I think it really goes to the bottom of many discourses on the Indo-Pacific and how Indonesia and Australia work together. One thing that we can always remind ourselves is that we're both the landlord or the tenants of this region. Both Indonesia and Australia share two oceans, and we have to work in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and that is something that most countries don't have to go through. And as we engage those two oceans, we are also aware that we not only manage our natural resources and our human resources, but we're faced with the regional dynamics and the new geopolitics that's surrounding both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So I have a sense that both Indonesia and Australia have almost a very similar view. We are both large democracies, and we're both G20, and yet at the same time, both our leaders have a perspective on the Indo-Pacific. If I may refer back to Indonesia, since President Jokowi took office in 2014, the Indo-Pacific has been a special attention for him since he launched the Global Maritime Forum, in which you and I, we had a discussion in Darwin on this and how it affects the geopolitics and Darwin and Perth when we invited President SBY to Darwin. And then also, since then, my foreign minister, Ibu Retno, has been consistent in promoting the idea of Indo-Pacific through IORA. And since 2017, we held the summit. And then in ASEAN, we pursued the ASEAN Outlook. And also in the Pacific, we now have a Pacific Elevation. And all three tie in with Australia's interests. You are more active now in IORA since you were chair, and you also have a special Indo-Pacific agenda, and you also have the Pacific Step Up agenda. So we have a common perspective. I suppose our visions might be differing from our capacities, and in a sense, what comes first. You mentioned about the bilateral relations. We have ample, and we really have ample. And I remember when I first joined Foreign Affairs, Indonesia Australia were always first to address regional issues like the Bali process, and since then we've got many other cooperation at the bilateral level. But at this point, geographically and geopolitically, we have a common perspective. Namely, we want to have the principles of openness, inclusivity, mutual trust, and respect for international law, as described in the ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific.
You know, it's true of both Australia and Indonesia that all countries have many different channels that they can use in their foreign policy. The bilateral tends to be the initial phase, but whether it's regional or global, and we're going to be talking in the course of this conversation about a lot of the different fora, which are essentially tools of diplomacy that both countries tend to use. I wonder if I could stick with the Indo-Pacific a little bit. Last year, Indonesia took a leadership role in convening the rest of ASEAN together to forge an Indo-Pacific outlook. And so we've got, as you rightly pointed out, some common basis in terms of how we see the region now and how we see the region developing. I'm wondering how we can use that common basis, the Indo-Pacific as a framework, to strengthen our relationship between Australia and Indonesia in two specific ways. Number one, to move beyond just being, the bilateral relationship. So how can we use the Indo-Pacific construct to move beyond bilateral and to make ourselves more than just neighbors, to deepen the relationship that we have?
That's an interesting point, Professor Gordon. And the reality is, the Indo-Pacific is a new idea, but it came out in various regional forums that both Indonesia and Australia are members of, in IORA, in APEC. In fact, since Donald Trump launched Indo-Pacific idea, and that was during APEC and in Da Nang in Vietnam. So it's just interesting that whenever these regional developments occur, Indonesia and Australia are always working closely. And at the bilateral level, as you mentioned, we're very tight. I was just talking to my colleagues in the naval headquarters the other day, and he was just reminding me that bilaterally we've got various naval corporations like the Kakadu, the Komodo, the Kaswari, and the new Horizon and Coordinated Patrol. So you did mention the point that bilaterally we're quite rich. Regionally, we work together in IORA, and we promote maritime cooperation to encourage other countries to establish a common perspective. Through the Southwest Pacific Dialogue, in which this year Timor-Leste is the chair, we're also reminding each other that stability in the Indo-Pacific is key. And also in the ARF and other forums, the Indo-Pacific is something that both Indonesia and Australia have in the back of their minds. However, as you might know, even the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean is a vast territory. I think we tried cooperation during the search and rescue for the Malaysian Airlines, and there we probably saw how limited the resources are, not only of Australia and Indonesia, but all countries. And so I think at the bilateral level, we have been building these building blocks for greater collaboration, especially through IORA. But most importantly, we've been encouraging other countries to have a perspective of mutual respect and promoting on what works and maintaining peace and stability and for the sake of economic growth and prosperity. So those are the approaches that we have been conducting, but there hasn't been one forum or one shall we say, dialogue forum or association, or even a regional approach that can truly address the Indo-Pacific. That's why in ASEAN, we work very tight with Australia. In IORA, we work very tight also, but still, it's such a vast agenda, the Indo-Pacific. It still will take time. I suppose we need to look at how the bilateral can be extended further by creating new initiatives, be that in addressing IUU fishing. But right now, I think in ASEAN, we all agreed that we need to work closer on managing the COVID crisis and economic recovery. So I think even though it will take time to find that framework, the current issues where we work together is something that will converge the Indo-Pacific agenda, like COVID and economic recovery.
Now, one of the challenges in a conversation like this, where we've known each other for a long time and worked together for a long time, is that we can throw out a lot of acronyms, but those acronyms really underlie a lot of the cooperation between Australia and Indonesia. So IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association, where again, Australia and Indonesia both had turns at the chair and have worked very closely on that. You mentioned APEC, which is probably the earliest of the regional kind of in the Asia Pacific regional organization. So the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative. On top of that, we have the EAS, the East Asia Summit. Obviously, Australia and Indonesia are both in the G20. We work together. You mentioned now, obviously, newer ones with the South Pacific being involved in that process too. Really, what is happening is there is an emerging architecture in the region. But you rightly pointed out there isn't a single architecture for the Indo-Pacific. It's not one Indo-Pacific association. It's a combination of all of those. I'm thinking about it just right now. The East Asia Summit because of the inclusion of India, is almost by definition a Indo-Pacific grouping. In a similar way, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, RCEP, would have been an Indo-Pacific grouping, but India has pulled out. I'm kind of curious as if you would just talk a little bit more about what you think needs to happen to develop an Indo-Pacific architecture. Are there particular fora that we ought to strengthen? Are there new fora that are needed? Just seeking your own personal views on this.
Thanks for that, and you're rightly so to point out that we have those forums, and like you mentioned, all of Indonesia and Australia are very tight-knitted cooperation. India, however, is not in APEC and not in all the forums except for AAS and IORA, and it is true that many of us were hopeful that they would join the RCEP, but even before COVID, we had a trilateral meeting in New Delhi, and both Indonesia and Australia tried to encourage India to participate, but understandable for a massive country like India, their chief ministers play a role. And so it dawned on me that at the end, the Indo-Pacific is, we were thinking in Jakarta in our research think tank, the BPPK, stating that first we had the Atlantic region as the force of economic growth. Secondly, there was the Pacific region, or the Pacific Ocean, and third is Indian Ocean region, in which my foreign minister for 3 years consecutively, as I returned to Jakarta, was consistent in saying that the Indo-Pacific is the current, future, and present strategy for global economic growth. And the word I choose was collaboration. And I know that many countries are not comfortable to create a new forum, but the current forums are actually trying to knit itself together. So personally, I would see that the current framework should be able to be pursued upon. The creation of a new one, right now the IORA is still going through a reform process of having a stronger secretariat. So even though there's no formal settings for the Indo-Pacific, our countries are utilizing the current framework so that we can actually converge for an Indo-Pacific agenda. But like you said, at the end of the day, while we're all converging, should we have a new forum, and how does India play the part? Eventually, India is an important actor to be included in the discussion. And I suppose if I may speak personally, Gordon, there is the bureaucratic or the diplomatic approach of maximizing the current forums, but at the same time, there are institutions like yourself to provide us with the hope. At the end, Indo-Pacific is a region that requires out-of-the-box thinking. And if we should not require a new forum, at least the key countries like Australia, Indonesia, and India could play a vital role in maintaining stability. And at ad hoc level, we can encourage other countries in IAS or in IORA to come together to build those collaborations. That's why this year we were supposed to hold the Indo-Pacific Connectivity and Infrastructure Forum in cooperation with the World Economic Forum, and my president was very happy to conduct that. But this COVID really is probably a game changer and made us realize that, at the end of the day, if we can't even meet and make economic growth, should we be worried about other challenges in the region like security? And should countries really risk in miscalculation or even pursue some activities that might be misinterpreted by other countries? So I think in a way, as much as we were close to creating a momentum for Indo-Pacific collaboration at an informal level, focusing on economic growth and even geo-economic growth, the COVID has also reminded us that before we go there, we can focus on the current challenges like COVID and vaccine diplomacy, as my foreign minister has been pursuing.
Well, let's stick with India for a short while if we could. I appreciate your focus on the existing relationship between Indonesia and India, and on the prospects for an Indonesia, Australia, India trilateral kind of discussion. A couple of weeks ago, I had a similar interview virtually with the Australian High Commissioner in New Delhi, who is Barry O'Farrell. He has the distinction of being the first High Commissioner posted to Delhi to ever present his credentials virtually. And it's one of the adjustments of the COVID-19 era. And so his entire tenure as High Commissioner has been in this new environment. And you several of times have mentioned how difficult it might be, but I think that really highlights the challenges. How do we continue to build regional infrastructure? How do we continue to deepen relationships when we need to rely upon these new tools? And I came away from that interview inspired with the new possibilities that, at least in the interim, until we can get back to meeting in person, are there for us. But let me go a little bit deeper in terms of the Australia, India, Indonesia relationship. In May of 2018, Prime Minister Modi visited Jakarta. He and President Jokowi inked a bilateral agreement, which was framed as an Indo-Pacific agreement in its core. I'm curious as to how you really think Australia and India and Indonesia might work together trilaterally to strengthen the ties between the countries of the Indo-Pacific, and more importantly, could strengthen the inclusion of India in the Indo-Pacific. Because just like there is no Indo-Pacific without Indonesia, there also really is no Indo-Pacific without India in that context.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. At the end of the day, regionalism really should move forward with more engagement with India. And that's probably why when our president, when Modi and Jokowi met, there was a collaboration in the Pacific, and how both countries can establish more concrete collaboration and cooperation. For the trilateral cooperation, it is already been conducted on several times. I just talked with Pasiswo the other day, and we have made much progress in that one. And it is a natural process for it to continue to be discussed at the next levels, and whenever the timing is right for each of those officials. So there is a natural progress in that direction, and probably time will tell, because the Indo-Pacific, like you mentioned, we can't really maximize all those forums without engaging India further, and Indonesia and Australia. We have our perspectives on how we want to maintain stability and inclusiveness in the Indo-Pacific. But again, unlike other forums like APEC or ASEAN, IORA itself we do refer to the Jakarta Concord and what our leaders agreed in 2017 for greater maritime cooperation. But at the end of the day, Indo-Pacific is bigger than just maritime cooperation. There is a trust building that needs to be established. So there are ample opportunities, be that in dialogues between foreign ministers, or dialogue between senior officials continuously, or even bringing it into other modes. But I think what we need now is the realization that the Indo-Pacific is here to stay. And it's not just an academic discussion, but really we got to get the relevant stakeholders involved, including for Australia. Western Australia is key. Indonesia, we've called Sumatra Padang the IORA capital of Indonesia. And in India, there's a lot of cities that I think once we get those actors more involved, those stakeholders, it can be beyond just a meeting of senior officials, but the people will realize just how what an important geographic region that they're living on. And I think that would be how our three countries need to really continue to pursue our goals for greater discussion in the trilateral.
We've already touched on the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, RCEP, several times. I think there's great hope with Vietnam kind of hosting the chairmanship this year of trying to bring this across the finish line by the end of this year. Indonesia has been actively involved and very supportive, as has Australia. I think there's probably a shared sense of disappointment that India has withdrawn. I'm curious as to if we think about an economic architecture for the Indo-Pacific, well, what can Australia and Indonesia do together to help strengthen RCEP 1, but also to work to kind of bring India into other fora as we go forward?
Interestingly, when we discussed with India last year in November, I think our senior officials had a chat with India, and New Delhi looked like they were very hopeful to join RCEP. But as they mentioned, there are various how do you say, chief ministers that have more pressing concerns. So I would imagine that one thing that, as you mentioned, the Darwin Perth group or mafia have always been pursuing is a practical approach. And in Darwin, and we had collaboration with Eastern Indonesia and with Western Australia. In Perth, you had a collaboration directly to parts of Eastern Indonesia and Western Indonesia. I think what could work, and this is me thinking personally, is from our experience at the consulate general level, is that when we engage those provinces closer to the Indian Ocean, when they realize just what a benefit it would be, it would surely be of interest for them to play a greater role and to find their way to benefit from the RCEP, and perhaps that way it will be something that New Delhi will find interesting, that the relevant regions in India will be pushing for greater openness, and the benefit of the RCEP and the Indian Ocean would be much clearer to those provinces. And I think that's a new kind of diplomacy, Professor Gordon. It's no longer the role of the capitals to convince all stakeholders, but now it's a bottom-up approach. When the provinces say, we want this to happen, and that's probably going to be the new diplomacy, the practical sub-regional diplomacy. And that could be an approach we could consider.
So to demonstrate my commitment to the bottom-up approach, I actually spent the last 5 days, just returned this morning, on the Cocos Keeling Islands, a far-flung Indian Ocean territory of Australia, which is actually closer to Aceh than it is to Western Australia. And if you put the Andaman Nicobar Islands there in Indonesia and Australia, you find in certain parts of this region, all three of these countries are really close together geographically, as well as in a policy sense. So, one final thing I wanted to wrap up with. Recently, the University of Western Australia launched a new professorship of Defense and Security Studies. And Professor Peter Dean, in launching this center, put up a map, which I'm sure that you'll like as well, going back to our discussion of the Darwin-Perth Mafia. But they basically drew a line from Darwin to Perth and then turned the map on the axis there. What that does is that puts, the Northern Territory in Western Australia at the top of the map, right next to Indonesia, Singapore, mainland Southeast Asia in the region. And it highlights, that down at the very bottom is you've got Tasmania and New Zealand and the east coast of Australia. And it really is a different way of looking at the world in terms of proximity. And I think it highlights why in your career you played such an important role in our bilateral relationship, as well as the integration of that region. The question I want to ask is, because you understand both countries so well right now, what do you think are the relative strengths and perhaps weaknesses, but primarily the strengths of both Indonesia and Australia that we should be leveraging? Where do we have comparative advantage or that things that we should be leveraging as we seek to kind of bind this region together despite the challenges of COVID?
I think, Professor, that's an inspiring map I'm looking forward to. I remember last time when you had Darwin in the center, that was very good for me as a consul. However, the reality is Perth is quite strategic also, so I'm looking forward to seeing how that map would look. I think what's more important on the map is that when people realize just how important this new map would be, and especially not only for Australians and Indonesians and also people in the region, maybe they'll realize that at the end we have this patch of democracy. You mentioned your visit, and you stated clearly about Andaman and Nicobar. Through the IMTGT, we are pursuing a cooperation between India, and they welcomed it a lot. And I think if I raise this to colleagues in Canberra regarding your islands, it would make the perfect sense. And they're ready to get more cooperation. So coming back to our strengths, I think both our democracies, we face challenges, and we face development challenges. We face also geopolitical situations that force us to see how we want to manage the region. But I think when our peoples begin to realize this is the future of our economic cooperation, and it might entice them to explore new ways for partnership and openness. In IORA, we were pursuing more filmmaking and youth exchange and even cultural exploration. I think for Indonesia, Australia, and India, especially for Indonesia and Australia, both our democracies, we can look into that region and say, guys, we project by 2030, this will be the future of our collaboration. We need to begin a long-term investment here, and the youths are possibly the best actors. And I think that with the COVID, it made us realize that this distance and connectivity is a problem, but Zoom really connects people so much more easier. I mean, like, never had I imagined to have a one-on-one with you. Usually I have to wrangle a bit, wait for my SBY to speak or the ambassador to speak, but now I have you all to myself thanks to Zoom. But I think this digital era and our both Indonesia Australia's democracy and our belief in a better future. That's one thing that both Indonesia and Australia have, I think, Gordon. Our youths are full of hope, and one thing about Australians, and when there's an opportunity, they really go for it. Yeah, they have a go, and Indonesians also, they never let go of an opportunity. So once our youths see the region of the Indo-Pacific as the potential future, they can proceed, and we should facilitate. And maybe when our governments can find that mechanism, we can probably make it more solid. But I thought that would be a really low-hanging fruit, Gordon. I know that we have a SEPA that Indonesia and Australia are pursuing, but this COVID Zoom platform has reminded us that we don't always have to go to each other's country. We are still connected in our hearts, and I know many people want to go to Bali now, and many Balinese are looking forward to visiting Indonesia, Australia, and many of our youths are looking forward to return to Australia. My daughter just finished her undergrad in Darwin, and as you mentioned, I'm still doing my PhD. My professor David Price is very patient with me on my doctorate degree. So as much as I'd love to conclude it, the COVID has made me need to work more at a Zoom platform perspective. But again, I think there's so much potential Indonesia and Australia have. The hope that our youths have, and once we remind them or encourage them to see the Indo-Pacific as the future of our collaboration, maybe they'll be the one that will open the doors more faster than the officials will.
Well, it was my honor to give you a little bit of an anticipatory promotion to your doctorate. I really appreciate the work you did as Consul General there, and we couldn't be more delighted to have you in your current role as Director of Inter and Intra regional cooperation in the Asia Pacific and Africa as well. Thank you for taking the time. I look forward to many more conversations and to engaging you in our work, both virtually via Zoom and as we are able to start travel once again. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
I'm going to thank you so much. Stay healthy, and my best regards to the friends in Perth Center. Take care.
Thank you. Appreciate it.